This program contains subject matter related to mental health and suicide. If you or anyone you know is in crisis, please call or text 988 for the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline.
You have to really study to see, is this adaptable to the community that I'm serving? Because there may be, community examples, individual examples, there may be very specific ways of explaining a problem that was created for pretty much a wide Anglo community. If you're going to have a program for Latinos, it needs to be a little different.
Hello, I'm Vic Armstrong, and welcome to Strong Talk, a podcast by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. On this show, I speak with guests about the challenges and solutions to making mental health care accessible to all. Thank you for joining me on this journey. My guest today is Dr. Pierluigi Mancini, chair of the Mental Health America Board of Directors, and one of the most sought-after international consultants and speakers on the subject of mental health and addiction. His specialty is immigrant behavioral health, and he's worked for decades on improving access to mental health through language. In other words, he's an expert on how we talk about mental health, which makes him perfect for this show. Welcome, Dr. Mancini.
Hello, Vic. It's great to see you, and thank you again for this invitation, and hello to everyone that's listening to us.
Always a pleasure to have you. But Dr. Mancini, I've got to let me start here because your title is it can sound pretty intimidating. So when you're at a dinner party, for example, how do you explain to people exactly what you do? How do you describe it?
So the simple answer, when I narrowed it down, is I save lives. And by that, I mean, I help people be able to find access to services in a way that they can understand it and they can apply what's being taught. Mm-hmm. So in essence, if we have people suffering in silence and they don't have access, they're going to be in pain and they may die. So I tell people I save lives.
Fantastic. And you and I both know, and I think we probably had this conversation in the past, that it's often difficult for people of color to access services because oftentimes those services are not available either in the language that they understand or in the context. It doesn't really include the nuances of race and culture and ethnicity, which can make it very difficult. But we're also very fortunate that we do have people like you who are champions in this field and who are advocating for everyone having access to mental health care. Can you talk a little bit, though, about how did you get interested in this field? What brought you into this behavioral health field?
Well, Vic, as you know, it's a very personal story for me. I was on my way to getting a master's in international business in my 19-year-old, ready to take on the world. And unbeknownst to me, I had a predisposition to addiction. So for about 18 months, I suffered under the spell of addiction while I was in college. Now, I was one of the very, very lucky people who found recovery at age 21. I was guided to treatment. I found recovery, and I've been in recovery since 1985. And what happened is when I was finishing my degree and I was going through counseling, there was a psychologist in the clinic that I was working at. And we would talk, and, he didn't have a lot of appointments, which I really didn't understand at the time. So I saw him always sitting by himself in the office. So I would go and talk to him. And little by little, I fell in love with the profession. And I started noticing that just like I was improving, I started seeing people come in, get help, and recapture their lives, recapture their families. So I fell in love with that. So I finished the master's degree, went back to school, and began working in the counseling field in 1999.
Ah, fantastic. So you really have your own lived experience that brings you to this space, which is always a plus. But how did you then migrate to specifically linguistics? How did linguistics become your focal point?
So this was actually seeds that were planted way back in 1985, 1986 that I didn't realize until the 1990s. So when I was going through counseling, my parents, I loved my parents. My father passed in 2003, but the last 20 years of his life, he was in recovery, and we had a wonderful relationship in recovery. And he and my mother both had lived in different continents. They speak different languages. But when we were having family therapy at the hospital that I went through, I saw this disconnect between the American-trained therapists and my mother in particular. And there was some disconnect about the information that was being passed on how the family needs to be supportive, how the family needs to set limits. And so linguistically, it wasn't so much because my mother was fluent in English, but culturally, it was. When in American culture, at least back then, we had this tough love approach, right? Well, you just got to kick them out of the house if they won't stop using, kick them out of the house. And well, in an Italian Colombian family, culturally, that doesn't make sense. We're gonna smother you. We're going to even give you more attention. We're gonna bring more resources. Sometimes to the point that it can be harmful if we let the person continue in the addiction or exhibiting mental illness without treatment. But that's when it started planting the seed. Mm-hmm. So as I went through my college career and I started working in the field, I was working in an adult English-only program. And in 97, two friends from other very well-known programs in Atlanta came to me and said, Pierluigi, we're having Spanish speakers knock on our door looking for treatment, and there's nothing in Georgia. There's no one doing this. The only things we had were a couple of DUI schools that had a Spanish language curriculum that they would give the participants, and then they would teach the class in English. And then later we had Spanish language DUI schools, but that was the extent of it, which of course that's psychoeducational. Mm-hmm. And that's when I got the divine message to start an addiction program at first, and then a full comprehensive behavioral health program that was multinational and multilingual.
Early in my my mental health career, I did a lot of different things, but one of those things was I used to run DWI groups, and this has been 20 years ago. But one of the things I know, at least during that time, is that the addictions work also was not really strengths-based work. It was really work that really focused more on the deficits, and it was work that was designed to change your behavior, but it didn't really tap into those cultural challenges, those social drivers that sometimes impact people, and especially as they relate to people of color or to immigrant communities, because often those nuances are different. The thing I think that's fascinating about your story as you share it is that you early on understood the balance between not just having the language, but also understanding that cultural context and how to build on those cultural nuances. And you mentioned also that your parents had lived in several different countries. Does any of that bring you to your focus on immigrants? Because you also have a heavy focus on immigrant communities and immigrant populations. So how did you begin to focus on those immigrant communities?
Well, at first I saw it was people that needed help, right? So these were people that whether they were arrested for driving under the influence, or they had identified, or their family had identified a mental illness or a substance use disorder, they had nowhere to go. And to me, the revelation, when I say it was my divine message, Vic, this was nothing of my doing. All I am is an instrument. when I heard this news, immediately my type A personality took off, and I created the clinic. I went to the Secretary of State, went to the IRS, went to all the things, and created a company, a treatment center. I got a state license, I got CARF accreditation, but nobody would help me fund it. And the people I was seeing were people that were uninsured, Spanish-speaking immigrants back then, highly populated, construction, the poultry, carpet plants, landscaping. So these were jobs that didn't provide health insurance, and they didn't have a way to pay for treatment. So it was a nonprofit clinic. I started knocking on every door that I knew, and nobody wanted to fund it because they said it hadn't been done before, and there were no outcome studies. To me, it was a no-brainer, right? If the person primarily speaks one language, we need to serve them in that language so they can learn and make the changes in their lives. Until 18 months into the opening of the clinic, I was giving up. I mean, all my savings were being drained. I was working 18 hours a day, and I couldn't find the funding. And people were coming. It was like 20 people a day. And I was doing everything. Intake, evaluations, individual, group, everything. So one night, Vic, I sat in my office and I said, God, if I heard you wrong, if I'm not supposed to be doing this, give me a sign. Because by this time I had 5 degrees. I said, I can find a job. I need some income. And I went home. And the next morning, I get to my office. There were 5 nuns from the Sisters of Mercy 3 nuns with the Sisters of Mercy with 5 patients and a check for $2,500 saying, can you help these people? And from that time on, I've never doubted that my mission in life is to make sure that there is an infrastructure for people that have limited English proficiency to have the opportunity to access services in their own language so they can live a healthy, happy life.
And you have a clinic.
Correct. So I had, when I built the clinic in 1999, I stepped down in 2016. And we built the clinic to be a place that it wasn't just treatment, because I'm a true believer in prevention, and I'm a true believer in intervention. You were mentioning back when I started, it was very shame-based, confrontational type of therapy. And there was nothing in prevention. So I believe we can prevent a lot of these issues, both in substance use disorders and in some mental health conditions, if we educate young people early and give them the tools. I also think we can intervene at any level. When I was being brought up, it was, you got to hit bottom. You got to lose everything. Well, no, you don't. Today we know you can intervene. You can cut it off at any level. And then direct clinical services. So we had 72 employees. We were seeing 150 people a day in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And both children beginning at age 3 all the way to older adults for the entire spectrum of mental health services. Now, when I stepped down, unfortunately, the board of directors merged with an English treatment program, an American treatment program. And several things that were the foundation of why we were so successful began to fail. The first one was, in Georgia, there was a law that was passed in 2009, 2010, where if you were going to use social services, you had to show verification of lawful presence. So, if you went to seek treatment, you had to show your birth certificate or your passport. And if you were a naturalized citizen, you had to show your naturalization papers. Or if you were a permanent resident or you had a visa, you had to show all that. And there was an exception in the law for programs and services that were saving lives, that if the life was in danger, then they were exempt. So I applied for an exemption because I was telling people I'm not going to stop an interview if someone shares that they are thinking about suicide to tell them to go get their papers before we can help. And I was getting ready to sue the state. And right before I did that, the commissioner met with me and understood what I was trying to do and gave us an exemption. So I did not have to ask for papers. Mm-hmm. But when the board merged with this other company was a quasi-government agency, and they could not have that exemption because the exemption is not eligible for those organizations. So immediately, a lot of people lost the trust. Most of our clients did not have immigration issues, mm-hmm. But they stopped going. So a lot of the services that we built, unfortunately, have fallen. So we're trying to rebuild because the need is still great here in Georgia.
I heard you share a while ago too about a situation that you had experienced or that you were familiar with, where I think there was a lady that was having a mental health crisis, and they were trying to assess whether or not she was hearing voices. Do you know the story I'm talking about?
Yes.
Can you speak to that?
Yes. So here's where language can be problematic. The way most systems deal with language is they say, we use the language line, mm-hmm. or, we use an interpreter. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. But language lines, to me, they're very helpful in avoiding a crisis, in providing immediate information. And it all depends in our world if that language line operator has been trained in behavioral health interpreting, mm-hmm. because we have our own language in mental health and addiction.
Right.
Same thing with interpreters. First of all, interpreters in the United States, there is not a license or a certification that's national, mm-hmm. right? Kind of every state is the Wild West. Some states do have a license or a certification. Unless you work for the courts. Mm. So in every state, a court interpreter needs to be certified. They go through a very rigorous, specific training to interpret in the courts because, that can be very difficult. But there is nothing like that for medicine or for behavioral health. Mm-hmm. So some states have qualified interpreters, some states have certified interpreters. But for the most part, in most of the United States, you can print a business card and say you're an interpreter, and that's it. And maybe show a certificate if you took a 2-week course somewhere on how to interpret. Mm. And so I have a really hard time when people think the solution for linguistic access is the language line and the interpreter, because you may be able to conduct an evaluation, but you cannot hold ongoing treatment, individual, family, group therapy with an interpreter in the room or with a language line in the room. Mm-hmm. That's not acceptable. That's unethical. So in this story, there was an older woman who lost her husband, and she started becoming very depressed, wouldn't eat, wouldn't get out of the bedroom, wouldn't get out of the house. The family was very concerned. So she had limited English proficiency. English was not her first language. So the family arranged for an evaluation with the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist did not speak the language that the woman spoke as her primary language. So they brought in an interpreter. During the evaluation, the psychiatrist wanted to know if there were any auditory hallucination. So the psychiatrist asked, "Are you hearing voices?" And the interpreter asked the woman, "Are you hearing voices?" Mm. And the woman said, "Yes, I hear your voice and I hear the doctor's voice." But the interpreter only told the doctor, yes, she hears voices. Mm. So a couple of more of those omissions or replacements by an untrained interpreter caused this woman to be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. And that created a level of trauma that that woman may not. And that still happens today, not just for language, but for culture. I have another example that happened 3 years ago. A woman is having a hard time going through a divorce, calls 911. She doesn't feel well. They send social service and they send police, like 911 does. And in the interview with the social worker misinterpreted a couple of the things that the woman said, and they put the cuffs on her and drove her to the psychiatric hospital for 72 hours. That woman ended up more traumatized, and today is very skeptical of getting any kind of mental health help because of that experience, which is a similar fear I mentioned earlier, that people are afraid to go to treatment, to therapy, because they're just afraid to be out in the community with all these masked people taking people away.
It's a very scary situation. So what would you say to someone who's listening to us right now, who says, English is not my first language, but either I or a family member or someone I care about, I feel like they're in need of mental health services. They're experiencing a mental health emergency, but I'm afraid to access services. What advice would you give to them?
So there's roughly 27 million people in the United States who are limited English proficient. And 1 in 4 kids live in an immigrant family in the United States. So the numbers are staggering. Luckily, we do have still the 988 line, press 2 for Spanish. So the first thing I would recommend is call 988. If you have questions, if you need help, call 988. The challenge is if the person you speak with who's a mental health professional, if they do determine you need help and they go look in your state, that's what the challenge is. We do not have the infrastructure in this country. Here in Georgia, we have been able to make some strides. I helped the Latin American Association develop a Directorio de Salud Mental, which is a directory of English, Spanish clinicians. It has about 100 clinicians signed up for it. So in Georgia, we can take them to that directory. There's also an Asian directory that has clinicians that speak multiple Asian languages. And so those are easy ways depending on your state. On a national level, there is LatinxTherapy.com, and they're trying to get people from different states to be in their directory. But what I would tell people is don't give up. Just keep knocking on doors, keep calling, keep talking to people. We've made a lot of progress in bringing in faith communities, and usually in immigrant, at least in Hispanic Latino communities, that's a very strong relationship. So go to your church, go to your mosque, go to your temple, wherever you practice your faith, and talk to the leaders. And usually those are individuals that the community agencies reach out to and make themselves available in case they have referrals. So the main message is, don't give up. I have a feeling that a lot of this is temporary. I know there's a lot of lawsuits about using these words and not using these words. Being an immigrant is not illegal. Having limited English proficiency is not illegal. So people just need to continue and hang in there. And unfortunately, it may take them a little longer to get the help that they need at this time.
Yeah, and I appreciate your point about, things change. We've seen where there has been a lot of energy around equity and health equity, and then we've seen now that we're at a point where it's almost taboo to talk about equity and health equity. So those things do tend to wax and wane over time. And so I agree. I think that we will come back more closely to the middle, where we won't have some of these strict challenges. But what do you say in the interim to someone who says, or why don't immigrants just learn to speak English? Then we don't need these different programs and different ways to access resources. What would you say to someone who has that opinion?
Well, and that's a great question, Vic. And I usually have kind of two sides to the answer. The first side is, having lived in different countries myself, the United States is the only country I've lived in where they try and limit how many languages an American can speak. And I think we need to change that. I think we need to promote speaking other languages. It's made me a richer person. It's made me more knowledgeable. It's helped me understand other cultures. Now, the other part that many people do not understand is because we don't promote learning other languages. But anyone that has learned a language other than English, especially as an adult, understands that it can take 3 to 7 years to become fluent in a new language. Now, fluency means 4 things: read, write, speak, and comprehend. And those 4 must be present, but it takes 3 to 7 years to be fluent in a new language. And what many people also don't understand is I have not met a single immigrant that doesn't want to learn English. I have not. But it takes time. You have to dedicate time to learn the new language. So what immigrants do is they learn their functional language. That's what the limited part is. So they may be limited to their job function, or they may be limited to interacting with the school for the kids, right? So they do speak some English, but it's limited. It's not fluency. And when you are in a crisis, when you are experiencing an emotional downturn, or you're experiencing a substance use disorder, or even if we stub our toe in a country that English is not the first language, we all revert back to our original language. The first thing people would say is, does anybody speak English, right? So we need to help people understand that it's not that immigrants do not want to learn English. Many do. Many learn English. They become fluent. But many others takes a long time and they struggle. And the big part is depending what kind of jobs they work. Many immigrants have 2, 3 jobs. There's very little time to learn the language. So it's not that they're not learning. But besides language, and when I talk about linguistic access, Vic, I also include deaf and hard of hearing. Because that's also an infrastructure that's broken in this country. We don't have the infrastructure to serve in mental health and addiction individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. I think there's more being built, but they have the American Disabilities Act, and they can sue states to make sure those services are available under that act. Spoken language is not a disability, so we can't sue under that. But it still is the same principle. If you don't have the therapist that knows American Sign Language, that client is not going to be able to have the opportunity to access the services, to get better and have a healthy, happy life.
And that's a fascinating point, which also takes me back to a point that you made earlier, because when you had mentioned earlier when you first started introducing some of your resources to non-English proficient communities, that one of the challenges you met was that people said it couldn't be done because it hadn't been done before. We haven't provided resources this way before. And it kind of brings me to your point about those cultural nuances, because often I think what we experience in the mental health and the behavioral health space is that while we value evidence-based practice, and I'm one also as a trained clinician myself who values evidence-based practice, but there's not a lot of practice that's been based on evidence from Black and brown communities or from immigrant communities. And so in large part, the evidence-based practice is not really evidence-based for the population that you're trying to serve. And so there's a need for that balance of evidence-based, but also community-informed and community practice. And so can you speak to the importance of that? Because part of what that allows us to do also is to create new resources that do strike that balance of utilizing the evidence-based practice, but also taking into account the nuances of race and culture and ethnicity. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of having that blend of having the evidence-based practice? Because there are some things that are core to mental health and addictions and suicide prevention, but there are other things that are influenced by the things that we are taught and the things that we're socialized to see and believe. And so can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, excellent points. So when I started and they asked me, where are the outcome studies? One of the first barriers I hit was I couldn't find Latino researchers. And I only found 3. And they're still around. Thank God, I think one retired, but Dr. Sergio Aguilar Cagiola, he's at UC Davis, Bill Vega, who I think is also in California, and Hortensia Amaro, who was in Boston. And she had a wonderful Latina women's program. It was a model, but that was it. So I couldn't find a lot of information. So there's 2 things there. There is science to service and service to science models. And there are things that have been able to be adapted to be used in immigrant refugee communities, like cognitive behavioral therapy, very successful practice. And we've used it successfully with immigrant and refugee communities. But then there are programs, there are modalities that I believe need to be created. I don't think they adapt well. And one of the reasons is because of all the cultural nuances that exist in how we explain the problem, for example. So if there are natural and supernatural reasons as to why I'm behaving this way, which modality is going to help me deal with that or is going to help me explain that? And we also have a tremendous difference within all 22 Spanish-speaking countries. That includes, Spain and includes all the ones in Latin America, from Mexico down to Argentina. And there are cultural differences among all of them. So I don't think that you can just translate an evidence-based practice and put it in practice. If you're going to do something about that, I always recommend that people use the word adapt. But you have to really study to see, is this adaptable to the community that I'm serving? Because there may be community examples, individual examples. There may be very specific ways of explaining a problem that was created for pretty much a white Anglo community. And it doesn't take into account some of those other nuances, like what I was trying to explain when the English-speaking therapist was trying to tell my mother about tough love. If you're going to have a program for Latinos, it needs to be a little different. I'll give you a clear example. When I first started, there was an interventionist company. Interventions, I think they're still going on when the family gets educated and trained by a professional, and then they confront the person that's having the substance use disorder. Mostly, I don't think interventions in this level are used for mental illness, but they may be. So they wanted to do an intervention on an Argentinian man who had a serious substance use disorder. So the therapist met with the family. They had a wife, 2 daughters, and a son. They had their weekly, twice-a-week meetings. Everybody was training what to say, how to say it, to not be blaming or shaming. And the end result of an intervention is that immediately when that intervention ends, the car is already running and the person gets in the car and they take them to the treatment program. And everything was set. It was almost like, I think, 6 weeks of preparation, something like that. And the intervention day came and the family wouldn't participate. They were afraid because this was the head of the household. So being trained without him in the room was easy. But when they started trying to confront him, they were not using what they learned. They had softened it to a point that it was not impactful. And in the middle of the intervention, the man went and prepared himself a drink and went and used the facilities and then came back like nothing was happening. So, if you're going to do an intervention in a Latino family, it needs to be structured different.
Yeah.
And the family needs to be educated differently. Yeah. You cannot just translate the manual and expect that the family is going to be successful.
Now, I also have to ask you about this, and because this is something I was not aware of, but rumor has it that somewhere along the line, you have won 6 Emmys. Is that correct?
Yes. And actually, I contributed to a 7th Emmy Award documentary. So again, Vic, it's all about understanding my culture and understanding how my culture needs to receive information. Mm-hmm. So when I first started, we started doing some research. What is the best way to educate the Latino community? And we partnered with the different consulates here, and we had a campaign called Vive Sin Beber, which is live without drinking. And said, well, how do we put it out there? So we did some research. We found out that for the adult males, the radio was the best. Now, this is the 1990s, right? So this is before internet and before Amazon Music and Spotify and all that, right? So people would listen to the radio. They listen music in the radio. So the adult males would be radio ads, radio service announcements. For the adult women, many of them either stayed at home, take care of kids, or they worked in homes where they could watch television. So for them, it was television. And for young people, it was a different altogether. We had to, go with music and other ways. So in one of those, we said, let's make a public service announcement to highlight drinking and driving. Mm-hmm. We have to acknowledge that some of our adult immigrants are illiterate. They don't have the education to understand. So we have to provide information in a way anybody can understand it. The solution for that is we always use what's called the universal Spanish. Universal Spanish is the Spanish that the Spanish television stations use in their newscast. It's a Spanish that can be understood by any of the 22 Spanish-speaking countries. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that sometimes you may need to explain a term because there is a different word in every country for that term in Spanish. So, one that kept coming up early on is hangover. Mm. So hangover in English is one word, it's hangover. In Spanish, you have like 12 different words for hangover, depending what country or what region you're from. So we needed to make sure that people would understand what we were talking about. So we had to spell out, the physical effects that you get after a heavy day of drinking, due to dehydration and however else we needed to explain it, instead of just using one of the 12 words, because that would leave many countries not understanding what you were trying to say. So I came up with the concept that we were going to have an adult male that was crying, was visiting this. Have you ever seen those makeshift cross with flowers on the side of the road where somebody has died? Mm-hmm. Well, we had one of those, and this man was sitting there crying, saying how sorry he was that he had driven drunk and it cost somebody a life. Mm. Well, that public service announcement was submitted for an Emmy, and he won an Emmy. So then we said, let's address suicide prevention. So we did one on suicide prevention, and he won an Emmy. And then we said, let's do another one on prescription drugs. And then that won an Emmy. Wow. So the 3 PSAs were followed by 3 documentaries. So we did a documentary on prescription drugs. We did a documentary on suicide prevention, and we did a documentary on underage drinking. And all 3 of those won Emmys. Wow. And then a year and a half ago, the state of Georgia asked me, they were doing an opioid documentary. And, I'm like a thorn on the side of many systems in the United States because, they see me coming and said, oh God, he's going to talk about language. But it was a 4-part documentary, and they allowed me to do one part, one section in Spanish to highlight this for the Spanish-speaking community. And that one won an Emmy. So it's been a great way to promote, to educate. And what made it successful for us is we had Univision partnered with us for all of those. So they would help us with the director and the cameras and all that. So it was a great partnership.
Wow.
We won those Emmys because the scripts were written by the community members. Whenever we were going to create a public service announcement or a documentary or even a new program, the first thing we did is we would have focus groups. We would invite the community to come in. We would present them the idea. They would give us the feedback on how we needed to communicate with them. Now, here's also something critical, Vic. If you're going to do that, you need to compensate the community. Don't just be asking for free stuff. Right. I mean, these are hardworking people that you're going to be helping, yes. But if they're going to give up their time and their valuable knowledge so you can succeed, you need to compensate. So we would compensate $25 for the hour of the focus group. We would provide food. If it was at night, it would be enough food to be a dinner. We would provide babysitting so we could have the full adult fully present and have someone else take care of the kids. We would have it in a place that was ample. So many of the schools would let us hold it in their cafeteria after school. It would need to be a place that they could access, that they could come to. But don't go into communities asking for all this information, expecting it to be free. I mean, you need to compensate because that's valuable information they're giving you.
Today, as we're recording this, we're just a couple of weeks away from Hispanic Heritage Month.
Right.
And so are there things that you would like for our listeners to keep in mind over these next few weeks, particularly as it pertains to mental health and addictions as we're entering into Hispanic Heritage Month?
Sure. So, September brings a lot of things besides my birthday.
Happy birthday.
So it's September 19. So we have Hispanic Heritage Month, but it's also Addiction Recovery Month. And we also have suicide prevention. So in September, there is so much to unpack that we can really make an effort to educate communities through Hispanic Latino events about addiction recovery, about suicide prevention, in a way that this community can understand, digest, and apply. One of the, actually, I was talking to some state leaders recently about a great opportunity here in Atlanta. The Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is hosting the United States Chamber of Commerce annual conference here in Atlanta, September 22nd. And I said, wouldn't that be a great opportunity to highlight the work that the state is doing on 988 in Spanish? So I got people connected and hopefully they will be able to do something. But it's what I want people to do is, once you've seen a Hispanic, you've seen one Hispanic, right? So everybody's different. Everybody comes from different families, mixed families, different skin colors, Afro-Latino, Asian Latino. So there is no homogeneity. So assuming that you develop something for one person is going to reach the masses, that's not true.
Dr. Mancini, it has been a pleasure talking to you today. I feel like I could talk to you for hours. But as we begin to wrap this up, is there any final message you'd like to leave or any tips that you'd like to share or pieces of wisdom about language access and mental health? Anything that you'd like for the audience to remember as we wrap up today?
Yes, very much so. If you know anyone that's suffering in silence because of language, please have them call 988 and press 2 for Spanish. If you are someone that's suffering, don't give up. I mean, treatment works, recovery works. We do have help available today. Like I said, it may take a little longer, but the message is you don't have to suffer in silence. The first step is to acknowledge there is something wrong and then to reach out for help. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. You can recover. You can have a very happy, healthy life and reclaim your life and enjoy your family.
Thank you, Dr. Mancini, for joining me for Strong Talk, and thank you to our audience. If you're not familiar, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, or AFSP, is America's leading suicide prevention organization and the largest private funder of suicide prevention research with local chapters in all 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. AFSP offers education, law support, and advocacy programs and events nationwide, including the Out of the Darkness Walks. You can learn more about AFSP at afsp.org. If you or anyone you know is in distress, call or text 988 for free 24/7 to reach the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Because you matter. Your life matters. Your pain matters. You are not alone. And that is Strong Talk.